My name is Paul Gisby, and on behalf of Accountancy Europe, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's event, Force for Change, Mobilising the Public Sector for a Sustainable Economy. We would very much like this event to be as interactive as possible as is possible over YouTube. So please ask your questions at any time throughout the event by submitting the question to Slido. The link to Slido is under the YouTube player and also on the screen right now with a meeting code if you go to www.sli.do. Please note that we may not have time to answer every question that comes in from the chat, and I hope for your understanding on this point. To kick things off now, I would like to welcome our CEO, Olivier Boutellis-Taft, who is a long-standing proponent of public sector sustainability in both fiscal and environmental terms. Over to you, Olivier.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to you and to Peter, actually, for leading the efforts of our public sector group in what, as you said, I regard as a very important topic. So I'm delighted to be able to share a few ideas with you to kick off this conversation, but you would expect any chief executive opening an event to say that he's delighted. So let me try to explain why. And to explain why, I just like to look at what is sustainability and what's a problem and what is the public sector, because I think that there are a few basics that we tend to forget here. So if you look at sustainability, I think most people today know and admit, which has not always been the case, that there is a problem, but too few know what the problem is and the magnitude of the problem. It is a vital problem. Wherever you look, actually, whatever indicator, if you look at biodiversity loss, for instance, well, it is not that we're going to be missing little birdies in the trees. No, it is creating a systemic problem, basically threatening our agricultural system, that is the food that we eat. And I think we do need food, don't we? Soil exhaustion, same problem as well, dealing with food again. I mean, researchers from the FAO basically estimates that we've got maybe, depending on the countries, between 50 to 70 years of crop left. I mean, what do we do after that, once we have no crop? Do we ask Mr. Musk to take us on Mars? I'm not sure they grow very good food out there, actually. So this is a vital problem, but we can also look on the shorter term before we reach these extremities, and we've got problems with our natural resources, almost all of them. Everybody's talking about oil, but if I look at what I'm reading on copper, phosphorus, even lithium, key to our batteries in our cars and our telephones, depending on these natural resources, we still have between 5 and 100 years left of them. So it is time to find a solution. And you will have noted that I voluntarily avoid talking about climate, because same thing here. Everybody's talking about climate, but not a lot of people, I'm afraid, really realize what the problem with climate really is. According to many researchers close to the IPCC now, our chance of reaching the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degree temperature increase is 0%. That's not a lot, right? And apparently our chance to reach the 2 degree target, which is the next best, is rated somewhere between 2 and 5%. Right now, if we continue and do implement the policy commitments that we've made, which, by the way, we're not doing, we are still on a trajectory that will put us around 3 to 5 degrees in 2050. So what does that mean? Well, that means that life will become more and more difficult with things like water and resource scarcity, probably massive wars and climate migrations, large parts of the globe becoming just inhabitable, including in Europe in the next 20 years. And on the longer term, like 50 to 100 years, it means a dead planet, a planet where the conditions that made life possible will be gone. So this is not, contrary to what we very often think and say, an issue for future generations. We've been talking about this issue for future generations for 40 years now, and we are the generation in charge. We are also the generation who will suffer from these evils. So, it's an issue now, and we've got a very short window of opportunity to mitigate the damages that we've created. Again, according to the IPCC, this window of opportunity is probably about 10 years. So we need to be zero carbon by 2030, which is pretty far from the often declared but also unpursued targets that we have. And today, I think the agenda is not, as still many people think it is, about doing less harm or doing no harm. It is about fundamental system change, because nothing else will deliver the results that we need to see happening. So next to that, a lot of people will ask, what has the public sector to do with this? This is a matter for us as consumers to, change our buying habits. This is a matter for industry to change the way they produce these goods that we buy. But why is it also a problem for the public sector? Well, what is the public sector? For many of us, I'm sorry if I may be, hurting some feelings here, but a lot of people think that the public sector is basically, people in offices consuming a little bit of electricity and paper. Well, sometimes a lot of paper, okay, and that's it. But I think there is a lot more to the public sector than that. Of course, the public sector is setting policies and rules. And rules are being set, but that's good. The real question is, are these rules, doing what they should be doing? Are we meeting the goals? That is the only benchmark. The benchmark is not how much these rules cost or how long will be the transition. I think the real question is, do the rules and policies that are being set put the planet in a safe place in 10 years? That's the only benchmark again. I mean, the public sector, to my view, is also very important because it is providing incentive and subsidies in addition to policies and rules. And if you look at subsidies alone, well, unfortunately, still in many states, especially outside of Europe, by the way, most of the subsidies are still going to oil and fossil fuels and more going there than into renewables. Another very important thing that the public sector is doing is tax policy. And my colleague Paul is actually in charge of a very important project for us on green tax. And I hope we will have an opportunity to talk about that in the future. There is a lot more, though, than all that in the public sector, because in most countries, and especially in Europe, where we tend to have a pretty large public sector, the public sector has a big stake, in a way or another, in our transport system, in our energy system, energy companies. It's also in charge, and that's important, I think, to remind people when we talk about the transport system. It's not only the cars and trains. No, it's the role it has in airlines, in infrastructure, airports, roads. I mean, there's a massive role all around this that the public sector plays. And also something that is critical to change, education. And here in Europe, education is largely a public sector matter. So that is essential, because without education, there will be no change. Procurement is also a critical dimension of a sector of our economy that usually, depending on the country, is a little bit less or a little bit more than 50% of the economy. That's what it is in Europe. So with this, big public sector comes a lot of procurement issues. Buying food for hospitals, cars for the police. So all that is giving the public sector an important, if not a critical role. How can we change a system? Because that's what we should be talking about. with a black spot in 50% of the system, the public sector. That's not possible. So it is, I think, an absolutely mission critical role, and I'm very happy that Peter, the chair of our public sector, and Paul, who is driving the work of Accountancy Europe in that space, is putting this on the agenda. And I'm also grateful to you, the audience, to have this conversation today. Let's just not forget that words are not enough. Now is time for action. Thank you, Paul. I didn't go to my 90 minutes, I think.
Absolutely not. Thank you very much, Olivier, for leaving us in no doubt at all about the level of challenges that we face, and also the role that the public sector has in meeting those challenges. So now we have the panel session, and I will hand over to Peter Welsh, who will be the moderator for this session. Peter is the chair of our public sector group and has over 30 years' experience of public sector financial reporting and auditing. He is currently the director of the Chamber of the European Court of Auditors, responsible for covering financial compliance and performance auditing on spending on agriculture, the environment and climate change. He is also responsible for driving forward Accountancy Europe's work on public sector sustainability issues. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. And thank you to Olivier for those words, which really started us off on the right note. And you touched on the issue of the number of harvests that we have left, which is actually one of the things that in my organisation we want to look at the future, in the near future. Soil sustainability is a very big issue. Our first member, we have 4 distinguished members of the panel. I'm going to introduce them one by one as they take their turn speaking. The first is Vivi Niemenmaa, who is a public sector expert in environmental audit. I first knew Vivi when she worked with me in Luxembourg on sustainability audits. She's now back in Finland, where she's a deputy director at the Finnish National Audit Office. And in her spare time, she runs the working group on environmental audit of INTISAI, so the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. So Vivi, you're going to talk to us both as a Finn and as a public sector auditor. So we're waiting to hear you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. I mean, it's great to be here, and I feel like this is a great learning opportunity for me. Like taking that sustainability reporting in the public sector. Like public sector is not really the forerunner here, but it's rather the private sector. And if we have the next slide, please. So there actually I kind of tried to put this there, that it's absolutely like private sector leads in non-financial reporting, and public sector has adopted reporting slowly. Perhaps it is unfair to say that there's no reporting at all. Certainly there is reporting on performance indicators and so on, but now if we talk about this more systematic and comprehensive sustainability reporting, then public sector is coming behind. But at the same time, public sector regulates private sector, like, for instance, the EU Directive of Non-Financial Reporting. And I just heard actually that New Zealand has recently introduced a bill that requires mandatory climate disclosures on entities that operate in financial markets. And these greenhouse gas emissions, there's also a need for assurance of those gases. So it's really like coming everywhere, also to this kind of focused like climate disclosure. And if we go to the next slide, please. So I worked a bit with sustainability, and one more, please. There is this. Yeah, good. Thank you. So almost 10 years ago, I worked a bit more with sustainability reporting. We did a study for the network of global network of environmental auditors, and tried to kind of introduce this topic to auditors in supreme audit institutions around the world. And okay, we kind of learned that, yeah, sustainability reporting should be embedded with the strategic objectives of an organization. It is linked to the building of transparency and trust and accountability. And then an interesting question, particularly from the auditor's perspective, is the assurance part. And at that time, according to our knowledge, like UK was the leader in the public sector on this kind of voluntary reporting. Oh, the slides disappeared. No worries. Yeah. So, but it was it's also like very much focused on environmental sustainability, on greenhouse gas emissions, waste, finite resource consumption, which might be also a good solution, because otherwise it might kind of get a little bit like kind of too big and vague and so on. But if I think back to 2013, it feels like nothing like really fundamental things have changed. It's pretty much still the same. Of course, there are more like reporting initiatives, but nothing like really big has changed. I feel like the biggest kind of input comes from the global sustainable development policy and the like a launch of the sustainable development goals. And these SDGs have created so much enthusiasm and inspiration that you can also notice in the reporting practices, also in the public sector. And if we go to the next slide, like what I noticed then 10 years ago and also still today is the question, like this certain unclarity, like what do we in fact report on? Like I remember almost 20 years ago in a city planning office, like, oh, we need to do some sustainability things. And then like, oh, like, do we talk about water consumption in our office? Or are we talking how the urban planning we do kind of creates preconditions for sustainable way of organizing society? So it makes massive difference. So we are basically talking about quite different things. And in the next slide, so this is from State Treasury of Finland. The way they've kind of tried to explain the difference between these two approaches. Like first, you can talk about footprint, which is these kind of direct negative impacts of activities in our offices or in whatever kind of organization we work. And then on the other hand, this like handprint, which is more like the positive impact that activities of an entity have on sustainable development challenges and chosen targets. So these just kind of simple concepts might help to understand what we're talking about, and not like that we talk past each other and don't understand like what's the difference. And now just like explaining very shortly this responsibility reporting project that's been led by State Treasury, and the point is that that both of these, both footprint and handprint, are in there. And next slide, please. So there's this guideline work going on, a first year of kind of voluntary reporting, but from 2021, all government entities should really do this responsibility or sustainability reporting. And in the next slide, you see again, like this handprint, footprint concept. In the next slide, please. Yeah, so on the left-hand side, like impacts and results, and on the right-hand side, it's more like carbon footprint or possibly something like social balance sheet, such a kind of tools there. And next slide provides this or gives this idea that the SDGs are really a starting point here, and the point is that all ministries or agencies should pick or choose from 3 to 5 SDGs, those SDGs that they most significantly could contribute or have an impact on. And on the upper part of this picture, you see it's about the process of prioritizing and selecting those SDGs, while in the lower part of the picture, it's more like this footprint side and facilitating internal change to make our everyday kind of work more sustainable. The long-term goal is to make this sustainability or responsibility reporting part of the annual reporting, but so far it's been a separate exercise. And in the next slide, it's just an example like how State Treasury, like what kind of SDGs they've chosen. And in the next slide, you see then the footprint approach, and how State Treasury has chosen this tool of WWF Green Office, where you set the targets and report annually to WWF. And that's a kind of systematic way to deal with the footprint part of the story. And the next slide, it's about National Audit Office, like those suggested SDGs that we wish to report on, still under discussion. But yeah, this is basically what it is. So, and if you look at the SDGs that we've chosen, like SDG 16 and 16.6, the target there, it's about effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. So it's really our everyday work. It's really in the heart of our work, whether it comes to financial auditing or performance auditing. It's about good governance and prevention of corruption and bribery and so on. And goal 17 about stakeholder cooperation, international work we do, as well as developing sustainable development approaches and our work with policy coherence. And then we've also chosen SDGs 8 and 10 to kind of represent the audits supporting efficient public governance, and then also like in the 10 we talk about this responsible organization or responsible employer. So next slide, please. So as I said, like I feel like the SDGs have created a lot of enthusiasm, and they are kind of fantastic tools to discuss about sustainable development and also report on that. But perhaps one risk is if you only look at the SDGs separately, is that you miss the kind of the big picture and exactly this kind of systemic problems that Olivier mentioned in beginning in his opening speech. So what I think it's very important not to lose this idea of Agenda 2030 as a kind of entity where everything's interrelated, and how the SDGs are in dynamic kind of relationship with each other. So it's about policy coherence between goals and targets as well. And as a small example, in the next slide, we just published an audit on climate finance to developing countries. So this tiny Finnish piece of the massive $1 billion per year Paris Agreement financing. And so we have this kind of climate target, which is extremely important. Yes, sure, and comes also from the kind of international agreements and global responsibilities. But at the same time, gender or women and girls are a special priority for the Finnish development policy. They've been there for a long time and still are like really the number one priority. So then it might not make sense to really look at them, audit them, or report about them like separately, but it's more like how they are in interaction So it means like how the climate funding, how it can address also the gender issues at the same time and vice versa. So my point is that policy coherence is very important for reaching the Agenda 2030, but it's also very important for the effectiveness of public sector spending. And it's crucial for addressing these systemic problems, and ideally also like sustainability reporting should take this into account. And I feel like this is one of the big challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivi. I'll just ask one question from myself. At the end of all four speakers, we'll have a panel discussion with questions from the audience. But a quick question from myself. Environmental audit has been a sort of specialist niche within the international auditing community for more or less as long as I remember. Can we maintain it as a specialist niche, or does it have to go mainstream? Does it have to become part of what auditors are doing all the time?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good question. Actually, this INTESAI working group of environmental auditing, it started in '92 with the Rio conference. So we are having a 30th jubilee next year. So it's indeed like 30 years ago. It was put together first, of course, quite a small group of supreme audit institutions, and then over the years it has expanded to become the biggest. Like we have 89 members currently, so it tells something about the importance of environmental topics, and that's certainly something that's been also discussed in our working group, like whether we should actually change the name to become a sustainable development group. But I think the conclusion has always been that we should indeed focus on the environment. And here we come to the question of environmental integrity. So if you just like mainstream it everywhere, it might disappear. Like that has been, at least so far, the kind of conclusion in our working group.
Okay, as you know, that would be consistent with some of our findings. Thank you very much, Vivi. We're now turning to our second speaker. I'm delighted that we've got Cecilia. Who are Cecilia? On your phone, I think. Cecilia Ekholm is Ambassador for Sustainable Business at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. She's been in that role since the 15th of January this year. Her areas of responsibility include promoting the Swedish government's sustainable business agenda and representing Sweden in international organisations such as the United Nations and the OECD. She's chair of the Swedish National Contact Point and representative in the GRI Government Advisory Board. So, Cecilia, we're looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Accountancy Europe, for inviting me to speak today. And as many of you may have guessed already, I'm not a sustainability reporting expert, but I rather bring something a little bit different to the table. As Vivi was mentioning, policy coherence is vital when it comes to sustainability reporting. And one of my most important tasks within the government is exactly that. I am, you may say, the hub for sustainable business issues within the Swedish government. And in that, I think my position is fairly unique in a global sense. I don't know how many ministries or countries that actually have CSR ambassadors or ambassadors for sustainable business, but I would guess not that many. We've had it in Sweden since 2002, so in next year it will be 20 years of ambassadors for sustainable business. And as Peter said, I have quite a few tasks, but a really, really important one is to promote policy coherence and policy development when it comes to sustainable business within the Swedish government. Next slide, please. And next one, please. So what I wanted to talk to you a bit about is more on the how and looking at the different angles that have already been mentioned. Olivier, for example, he was talking about the policy formulating task of the public sector. So I will get into that. And he was also talking about the importance of using public agencies, and I will go into that. How do we actually implement the agenda within the Swedish public sector? So next slide, please. So starting on policy coherence when it comes to sustainable business, and then we'll get down to sustainability reporting. Don't worry. We do have some main documents and platforms when it comes to sustainable business. One of them is obviously the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and that is there because we do have human rights reporting issues that are connected to that. We also have the Platform of International Sustainable Business, which was launched in December 2019. And that is a whole of government approach, meaning that we involve all government ministries who do work with different angles related to sustainable business. So connected to that platform, which is incidentally, it's very broad. It does not only cover what we usually look at when we talk about sustainable business, which is basically responsible business and transparency, i.e. reporting, but it also covers the private sector contribution in fulfilling the SDGs and combating climate change, for example. It also encompasses our working methods. So it's a very, very broad document. And connected to that, we have an interdepartmental working group which I lead, and where we have all relevant ministries participating. So it could be the Ministry of Justice, who are incidentally in charge of reporting, sustainability reporting legislation. Ministry of Industry, who are in charge of the state-owned companies. Ministry of Labour for, of course, labour rights. Ministry of Environment for environmental issues. Ministry of Finance for tax, etc. They're all there in the same group. So, of course, that also encompasses sustainability reporting. And the general view of the Swedish government when it comes to sustainability reporting is that it can contribute to strengthen human rights, democracy, gender equality, and the rule of law. It's also important in combating climate change and environmental degradation, and can contribute to strengthen fair and decent work conditions in the labor market. So I think I'm basically echoing everything that Olivier said in the beginning. In the platform, we also have 168 actions that are supposed to be implemented between now and 2022, which is the government in office. And within that, we have a couple of actions related to sustainability reporting. So, for example, the European Directive on Non-Financial Reporting that Vivi mentioned, and I will say a few words on that later. The reporting of state-owned enterprises, I will get back to you on that as well. The way Team Sweden actors report, and you may wonder what Team Sweden actors are, and I will also explain that in a bit. We also work with and support the Global Reporting Initiative, and as Peter mentioned, we interact in the GRI Advisory Board, and I will say a few things about that later as well. But apart from that, we also arrange seminars and capacity building, for example, with GRI or academia or organizations when it comes to sustainability reporting. We supported initially and are looking into whether the standard ISO 26000 should be reviewed and enhanced. There is a reference group in the financial sector, and that reference group started out with 20 participants. But now it has over 100, so the interest for these kind of issues is enormous. It creates a big interest between different stakeholders. So in that group, in that reference group, we do not only have government officials or agencies, but also representatives from the civil society, financial markets, and industry actors. We have government agencies and private sector who participate in other international activities, such as the International Organization of Securities Commission, who are right now involved in a very, very interesting project with all the global standard setting organizations to try to find a global standard for sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. So moving on to the pushing the agenda, which was one of the points that Olivier mentioned that the public sector can do. So I will just give you a couple of examples because there are many, but it would just take too long to go through them all. So 2 examples, just from our Swedish perspective. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, but for those of you who are not, it's something that we can see as a public good. It's an organization, an independent organization that formulates standards for sustainability reporting. And today there are more than 10,000 reporters in over 100 countries. So it's one of the biggest platforms. And Sweden started supporting GRI at least since 2008 and gave core support from 2012. And today we're actually one of the largest donors to GRI through our development agency, SIDA. We've also tried to broaden the agenda a bit by facilitating cooperation between GRI and the Danish Institute on Business and Human Rights to streamline human rights in GRI reporting. And this, of course, is a standard today that's widely used in Sweden. And I will have an example of that later. We mentioned the non-financial reporting directive, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with as well, but just in case, it's an EU directive that requires companies that have over 500 employees to disclose non-financial and diversity information. And Sweden, when Sweden implemented this directive, we actually made the requirement to prepare sustainability reports to cover more companies than were required by EU law. So in Sweden, we have a threshold of 250 employees. So enterprises over 250 employees need to disclose non-financial and diversity information. Recently, very recently, I think in April, there is a new proposal on an updated non-financial reporting directive, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, also an EU proposal that will be discussed and negotiated within the next couple of months. And what does that do? Well, it extends the scope of the companies, it requires external audits, it has more detailed reporting requirements, it foresees an EU standard, and it foresees digital tagging of reports. So the Swedish view is that we welcome the Commission proposal because we think that improved reporting and increased comparability makes it possible for stakeholders and interested parties, such as investors and consumers, to make informed choices. It can direct resources to sustainable investments and create better conditions for companies with sustainable business models. We also welcome that large companies and parent companies in large corporations are included in the new regulation, as we already did go further than the old one. We also feel it's good that it clarifies what sustainability information the companies need to report on, and that encompasses a wide range of sustainability issues. To refer back to what Vivi said, what do we report on? We think that giving more clarity on that is a good thing. Having an EU standard is welcome, but it would definitely need to be closely aligned with existing international systems and standards, so it can be adjusted in accordance with developments on a global level, as the best outcome is actually a global standard because we do have today global markets. So even if there would be an EU standard, it's really important that it's closely aligned with the global initiatives when it comes to sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. So moving into my part on implementing the agenda, how has Sweden as a public sector implemented sustainability reporting in our own organization or organizations that the government controls? So my first example is on the Swedish state-owned enterprises, and there are actually 46 of them today. And they have actually reported or submitted sustainability reporting since 2007. And the information I have is that the Swedish government at the time was the first one globally to require that of our state-owned companies. And it was based then and today on GRI reporting standards. Today, it's not an absolute demand that the state-owned companies use GRI, but most of them use GRI either as a base or they adjust it to align with their own business activities. And why do we do this? Well, it is because in Sweden, the government believes that state-owned companies are expected to lead by example. So in 2008, which was the first year, in 2007 they were required, in 2008 the first reports were published, over 90% of the state-owned companies reported using the GRI standard. And if you want to compare with the 100 largest listed companies in Sweden the same year, 25% of them did. And we know that many of the Swedish state-owned companies have also received awards for their reporting, and now they have quite a lot of experience. In relation to the non-financial reporting directive, the government also decided that all state-owned companies, irrespective of their size, need to publish sustainability reports. So in that sense, we went even further when it comes to implementing the legislation. Another couple of examples in how we mainstream sustainability reporting and use it practically within the public office is our Team Sweden actors. And who are they? Whether the government agencies and financial institutions in our export promotion and investment promotion work, as well as the entities that are working with value chains and markets abroad. And in Team Sweden, we do not have only the agencies that work with actual projects and business opportunities, but also those who are working with improving markets and general conditions, such as our development agency, or the ones who are working with supporting Swedish companies out in the country, such as Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth. So within Team Sweden, we have quite a large reach. And it's a very good way for us to be able to coordinate our sustainable business actions when it comes to Swedish companies who are markets abroad or through the value chains. I will just give you two examples. The first one is Business Sweden, which is our export and investment promotion agency. And they have sustainability reports from 2017 on their website. You can go in and you can read them there. They're there from 2017 and onwards. And their reporting is a type of adapted reporting, which is partly based on the GRI standard, but also tailor-made indicators to measure the impact. Another example is on the finance side, which is the Swedish Export Credit Agency. And they have sustainability reporting as a part of their annual report. As Vivi said, the integration of sustainability in annual reporting is important. And here's an example of a financial institution that has done just that. They use the GRI standard at core level, and they also use part of the GRI standard for financial actors. But climate-related risks and opportunities are disclosed in accordance with the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So they have, as Vivi mentioned with some of the Finnish agencies, they use more than one standard. And if you permit me to end where I started when it comes to policy coherence and why we feel that is so important. To refer to Vivi's example on the SDGs, we believe it is important with policy coherence because if you integrate your sustainability issues from the beginning, it will be much easier to report. So, for example, we now see today that many companies and many other actors are integrating, for example, their SDG targets or their SDG impacts in the beginning of a project or a business. And of course, if you do that, it's much easier. So in that way, we can support initiatives that will help companies to do their SDG mapping. And if that is done, of course, it will be easier to report on it afterwards, because then you know what your potential positive and negative impacts will be. Another issue, for example, or another example would be the coming mandatory legislation on due diligence on human rights and the environment. So if you know what criteria you're supposed to look for in your due diligence, it will be much easier to report on it. And hence policy coherence, when you connect the dots, makes it much easier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I'll ask a question myself immediately. I want to just remind people that they can submit questions through Slido, and we'll put up the reference to that in just one moment. Cecilia, you spoke quite a lot about the GRI. Why has Sweden chosen to support the GRI, and are you seeing a payoff for that? Is it producing results?
Thank you, Peter. Well,
so just to interrupt, for people watching, you can now see the reference to submit your Slido questions, and please don't hesitate to do so. Sorry, Cecilia, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. No, please ask questions. It'll be more fun in the panel if you do. So on GRI, why has Sweden decided to support GRI? Well, it was quite early on identified as a platform which enables open dialogue on norms and means in providing in a sustainable manner. And by interacting with companies, it also provides tools when it comes to sustainability reporting. And as I mentioned before, we believe that also contributes to the larger agenda when it comes to implementing the SDGs and a sustainable economic recovery. So basically, we think GRI is today one of the largest platforms. And it's also, as I mentioned, widely used in Sweden and globally. So we think it's a good organization to support. In addition, what they do, which I think is quite interesting, is that they're constantly pushing the agenda. So integrating, for example, human rights in all of their standards right now, which I'm not sure that everyone does, and it has a very, very broad. They have a very, very broad scope when it comes to standard, and it is a public good. So that means that any company can go in and use them at no cost.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thanks for your contribution. So stay on standby. We'll have the panel discussion after the next two speakers. Our third speaker is Carol Adam. Carol, thank you very much for joining us. Carol is joining us from Melbourne, I believe. So it's much later in the day, I think, there than it is here. I'm not quite sure what the time difference is. Carol is Professor of Accounting at Durham University Business School in the UK and Swinburne Business School in Australia. Carol has served on a number of boards in the finance, education and not-for-profit sectors. She's also served as a member of the Sustainability Advisory Board for Fuji Xerox Australia and Sustainability Leadership Advisor to the Commonwealth Education Trust. And she's a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Carol, I know I've heard you speak on this before. I know you've got lots of experience. We're very much looking forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it was a really great introduction by Olivier, I thought, stressing the urgency of the problems that we're facing. And the public sector, as Olivier said, makes a lot of the decisions about infrastructure. And in making those decisions, it must consider social and environmental issues. And this is not something that we're really taught. So in the professional accounting syllabi and at universities, I don't think we're really very good yet at teaching people how to incorporate social and environmental issues into capital expenditure decision making. So that is a big issue. And as Vivi said, the public sector is behind the private sector in sustainability reporting, so that information isn't necessarily to hand to make those decisions, except in Sweden, of course, where they're using GRI reporting widely. And I have seen some very sophisticated methods of incorporating social and environmental issues into CapEx decision making in, say, the water sector and in local government. But I expect that there is a lot more that could be done in other areas. Olivia also mentioned universities. Now, I do think universities have a really huge role in the transition, not just through education, but also through research. And there's an increasing emphasis in the university sector on the impact that research has, and particularly the impact that research has on key global challenges that we're facing, like sustainable development and achieving the SDGs. But I think in like so much of what we do in the public sector, the performance measures are not really helping this transition. So in the university sector, for example, on research, there's a lot of emphasis on the inputs to research. So universities are assessed, and rankings look at the amount of grant income that universities receive for research. And in terms of outputs, they might look at the number and quality of publications, but not so good at looking at, well, what does the research do and how is it really making a difference and making a contribution to solving some of these big global challenges? So that's another thing that we need to be thinking about, the performance measures that we're assessing public sector organisations by. National governments are accountable against the Sustainable Development Goals, against their contributions. So they need to collect a lot of data at various levels of government and in the public sectors too. And the Australian Senate inquiry into the SDGs really highlighted the importance of transparency and engaging in particular with civil society organisations and a broad range of stakeholders in order to make sure that the right data was collected and to work in partnership on ideas to help achieve the SDGs. And we had mentioned earlier of SDG 17 on partnerships for the goals, and this was really emphasised through the Australian Senate inquiry, where contributors talked about methods of collecting data, measuring performance, and communicating performance. And what came through strongly was that need for collaboration, the need for accessible information, and above all, the need for a central, high-level government coordination. And in Australia, that would be from the office of the Prime Minister. And so then looking at other things that really help the transformation, and I'm going to draw on some private sector research that I've done with Subhash Abhay here, where we looked at what are the key drivers for change and that transformation that Olivia highlighted was so badly needed. And we found that there were 5 key parameters, each with a sort of a continuum. And these parameters were the things that really indicated how much organisations were changing to incorporate sustainable development thinking. The first one was how they think about sustainability. And at the lower end of integration, they were thinking about it as a business case. At the higher end, and none of the companies that we actually examined got this far. They were really thinking about sustainable development and the SDGs. Somewhere in the middle, they might be thinking about procurement and the supply chain and sustainability issues through the supply chain. The second of these differentiating factors or parameters was the focus of value creation. At the lower end of integration, those who weren't doing so well, they were thinking about value creation as enterprise value. They were taking an investor perspective. And there we found that there was less integration of sustainable development thinking. At the other end of the continent, they were thinking about value creation for the organization, for society, and for the environment, and recognizing that you can't have value creation for the organization without also thinking about the impact on society and the environment. The third differentiating factor was the attitude to sustainable development risk. And at the lower end of the integration, they were thinking about sustainability risks as, it's about their reputation. And, it might damage their reputation. They hadn't really got into even thinking much about, climate change risks beyond that, and the annoyance of legislation around climate change, perhaps. And they certainly weren't thinking about physical climate change risks or reporting it in any significant way. And at the other end of the continuum, they were seeing sustainable development risks as a threat to the organisation, to society, and to the environment, and something that needed to be tackled and incorporated into strategy. The fourth factor was integrating sustainable development into strategy. At one end, there was a sort of a weak attempt to do that. And at the companies that were doing the best were really integrating sustainable development into strategy, and they had a strategy to make a positive contribution to the sustainable development goals, not to all of them, but to the key ones relevant to their business. The fifth differentiating factor was the orientation of the internal systems and processes. So at one end, they were oriented to profits, and at the other end, they had systems and processes that were really oriented to helping them make a positive contribution to these sustainable development goals. So what does this and these five differentiating factors, what does this mean for sustainability reporting? And reporting to facilitate that transition to a sustainable economy? Well, it must cover the impact of the organisation on sustainable development. So I'm definitely with the Swedish government that GRI reporting is very relevant and very important for the public sector, particularly with those infrastructure decisions that Olivier referred to and I mentioned earlier. It must cover require disclosure on the strategy regarding sustainable development issues, and it must also cover the approach to identifying sustainable development risks and opportunities. So how does the organisation go about engaging with stakeholders to identify those issues relevant to the organisation in the first place? So that's part of the management approach, which needs to be disclosed. Along with the management approach, there also needs to be disclosure of the oversight of the governing body of public sector organisations. Particularly with regard to the development of strategy, which is the responsibility of governing bodies. And the role of the governing body in that strategy also needs to be specifically disclosed, as well as their own skills, the skills of the governing body members with respect to sustainable development issues. And above all, it needs to be mandatory, because there's been a lot of research looking at what happens when reporting isn't mandatory, and it's not necessarily the fault of these voluntary guidelines. In fact, not at all. It's only regulators that can make reporting mandatory. And without that, we always see greenwashing, things omitted from reports, and so on. And also, what does this mean for assurance? Well, with all these new types of reporting, when organisations are doing this for the first time, when they're increasing their level of reporting, which must happen. We can't dumb this down as much, as many people would like. It is a complex issue. There's a lot of interdependencies across sustainable development issues. So we do need to develop new forms of reporting and increase the level of disclosure. That involves new data sources. So that requires internal controls to be developed and more work for internal audit. The scope of external assurance must cover these management approach to determining material issues, sustainable development risks and opportunities, as well as data points. And that's often something that's missing from assurance scopes. So we need a much broader scope for the assurance, external assurance, and public sector assurance of disclosures. Thank you.
Carol, thank you very much. We got nearly an hour into this presentation before anyone used the word greenwashing, unless I missed it earlier. So I'm glad you brought it in. Do you think there is a realistic prospect of external verification of sustainability information in the financial statements of public sector and of private sector bodies? Do you think this is about to happen, or what's your
I think
sense of where this is going?
I think Vim might be able to answer that one better, but I do think that it is very slow to change. A lot of the work that's been done on external assurance indicates that there's a big focus on the data. Very easy to assure the data, but assuring the approach, the systems and the processes and the governance oversight is something that is not well done. It's not included in the assurance scope, and that's partly also a cost issue, reducing cost. But that's why it needs to be mandatory, and it needs to be mandatory that it's within the scope of the assurance exercise.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol. That's really helpful, and I think you've set the scene for our fourth and final participant. So I'll introduce Wim now. Wim Bartels is a partner at KPMG, Sustainability. He started his career in financial audit and joined the Sustainability Department in 2003. And since then, he's focused on reporting and assurance for multinational companies such as Philips, SAP, a brewery. Always good to know. He's a member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures since its inception in 2016. He serves on a number of other international initiatives, such as the Corporate Reporting Dialogue and the Sustainable Finance Group of Accountancy Europe, where he's the chair. So Wim, it's great to have you here. You're here to to bring that point of comparison with what's happening in the private sector, which is of fantastic interest to us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me with maybe a bit of a different perspective, as I am indeed coming from the private sector. And I thought, like, for today, indeed, to make the comparison, let me focus on 5 elements and developments that I have seen in the private sector and that we may also transfer to public sector sustainability reporting and actions. And you will notice that during my introduction, I will echo some of the words already said by the previous 3 speakers. But let me first introduce the 5 topics. So the first that I want to touch on briefly is materiality, and particularly double materiality. The second is integration of indicators and into core business. The third is linking sustainability to real impact. The fourth is with reporting creating a feedback loop. And then finally, seeing disclosure as a journey, which is mostly about the way forward once you start as an organization. So the first one on materiality, and I'm starting here with the perspective of what I've seen in the private sector. And those of you who are familiar with sustainability reporting know that the materiality assessment process to identify the material topics is the most important and critical step for any sustainability report. However, in the beginning, we have seen companies starting to report on many topics rather than the ones that are really needed to focus on, that are most material to their impacts as a company or to their business. So over time, I have seen that companies started with many and then decided to really focus on the, call it 5 to 8 key topics that really made a difference to their company and where their company made a difference. And then also there was increasingly an understanding of the link between these material topics and the key objectives of the organization. So nowadays, gratefully, a number of companies are linking the impact of environment, social, and governance issues on their key business objectives, and with that, linking sustainability also to the business itself. That lens, if you like, of not only looking at the impacts you have as an organization, but also what the outside world can mean for your core objectives is I think the change we're currently going through in the private sector. Climate is the first one, I think, with the TCFD, but many more sustainability topics will follow, I assume, in the years to come. And if I link that to the public sector, then I would say the first thing to note in your reporting, but I'll also link that later on to the public sector's activities, is being aware of the interplay, if you like, between environment, social, and your key objectives. And I think, Carol, it was you who talked briefly about infrastructure. And if I link that for a second to climate risk, and I think the core question, some of the core questions are, what does this infrastructural project mean in terms of the impact we have on the climate with call it the production of it? And on the other hand, that specific piece of infrastructure, how can that be impacted by climate at the same time? So linking these two is the first thing that I learned from my work with the private sector. Now, the second, I named that integration, linking to core business in the private sector, I think into core activities in the public sector. For a second, if I go into the history in the private sector, many companies started with nicely reporting on everything they did, just programs and activities to be good for the environment and help with social activities, mainly the communities, by the way. But then over time, they learned that they needed to report also on their performance in terms of quantitative measures and started to identify indicators. And then realizing that maybe indicators might not be enough, and you also need targets so that the stakeholders can see where you are against your targets and you can steer and manage your own performance. And then with all these targets, and that is quite a recent development within the private sector, companies started to realize that it's not only about the sustainable development targets, but also that these targets need to be linked to the strategy and to the strategic objectives, even more become strategic objectives in themselves. And that is the moment where sustainable development and call it the mainstream business strategy become a kind of integrated. And I think also there, Carol, you said you said words about that on how that is a differentiating factor, and where a company is not only looking at sustainability as something separate, but really linking it to the core strategy. And that is for a number of companies where we are now. Again, if I link that to the public sector, I would say for any public sector organization, the question should be asked: what are the 3 things for ESG, environment, social and governance, that we need to consider that are core to our objectives as a public sector organization, and what are the things therefore that we need to integrate in just everything we do. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the next step was a kind of, next element was a kind of integrating and linking it to core activities. Now, it has been said a number of times already today, that is the link to real impact, and the SDGs have been named quite a few times, and I'm going to repeat that. Where companies are nowadays is not so much like, are you working on sustainability? Are you maybe even integrating it into your strategy? But what is your contribution to societal goals? And therefore, as a kind of a framework, what is your contribution to the SDGs? Companies are moving from, first of all, input, then to output, now to real impact, and an increasing number are really connecting their sustainable development activities to these SDGs. And I think the critical question here is not so much whether they are linked to the SDGs, but is it enough what they are doing? And here I think it's also a critical point for the public sector to consider. And I heard Vivi say in the beginning that in Finland the activities are linked to the SDGs, which is, I think, the right step, particularly for public sector, you would say. But the critical question also to ask is it enough? Are we really addressing and aiming to achieve the targets set by the SDGs? And in that regard, you would also expect reporting to be integrated. That's to say, to have not only financial reporting, but to have sustainable development reporting or SDG reporting alongside. And if I take for a second the Netherlands, in the Netherlands we have many important days, but two important days every year from the government. One is the budget day, which is in September. And then we have another day in May, which is what I call for here accountability day, where amongst others we report on the progress against the SDGs. And for me, that is an interesting split of reporting, and I would recommend any public sector organization to combine the two even more, to integrate the two on the back of the earlier points that I shared today and that I learned from the private sector. Then I think the fourth, and here it becomes really important also for real performance improvement, is to link reporting to the decision making, and therefore creating a feedback loop. When sustainability reporting started, many companies saw that as a kind of a separate exercise. You do it once a year, you collate the data, you put it in an annual report or in a sustainability report, and then you disclose that, and then you're done. Over time, I have seen that increasingly that information has been integrated now in an annual report. So that's also linking back to my previous point, and to involve the board in the disclosure, but also then in what it means for performance improvement. And I would therefore say closing that feedback loop is very important. That comes with increasing the frequency, and that forms then the basis to really integrate it into decision making, and make decision making not a one-dimensional but a multi-dimensional activity. Final point from my end is then seeing disclosure as a journey. So with these 4 steps, focusing on the real material topics, looking at the two sides of the coin, what does sustainability also mean for my activities, setting key indicators linked to those core activities with targets that really focus on the real impact of an organization on society, and therefore that meet the sustainable development goals, and making that an integral part of decision making, comes then also with seeing disclosure as a journey. And what I mean with that, to say with that, is that many organizations I have seen hesitating with disclosing information, with taking small steps, and seeing that as something that they would need to fix in one go. And I must say, I have never ever seen one company succeed in making the best report ever in the first year. What I also have seen, back to that performance improvement, that is by that feedback loop, the reporting gets better. By better reporting, the performance management gets better, and that again results in better reporting. So I would recommend everyone working with public sector organizations here today, and I assume that most of you, to see disclosure really also as a journey. Two final comments. So I shared a few points where I think public sector can learn from private sector or mirror on what the private sector has learned. But I would also say two final things. One is lead the way, show the stakeholders of the public sector, and with that also the private sector, how sustainability reporting can be done also for public sector activities, and connect with the private sector, because I'm convinced that the two sectors, if there is a real split, by the way, but can learn so much from each other and can together make the world better than we have started, all of us in it. And with that, Peter, I hand back over to you, and thanks for listening today.
Wim, thank you very much. I nearly had a you're on mute a moment then, but I skillfully avoided it by muting myself. Thank you for that. Do you think that the public sector is ready to learn from this? Really, it seems to me, much more developed experience that there is in the private sector. Is that your feeling? I mean, I'm slightly putting words into your mouth here, but do you think the public sector is ready to learn from this? Well, what would you see as the big difference that comes when you try and apply this in the public sector?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the private sector has, of course, started with this whole exercise, if you like, or development, and has such a long experience that the public sector can indeed learn a lot from the private sector. I sense that there is some some connections being made between the public sector and the private sector. So if you ask me, is the public sector ready? I can't really answer that question for the full public sector, but I think there's an increasing notion that the two may be closer together than we have designed it in the system over the past decades. And having said that, and to your point of, and what's the key difference? Well, I think the key difference is that when I look at the private sector, is this profit element of the private sector makes it much different from the public sector, where the public sector is a kind of intrinsically looking at societal goals and working on this. And in that regard, to turn it around, I think the private sector can also learn a lot from the public sector on how you look at the real impact you make and the real change you want to create. And just a small example, I have been on the board of a foundation for schools, for primary schools, and I was really got excited by the way they looked at their college business, which was, we need to deliver to society the best children with the best education, and that's what we measure, because that's what we want to achieve. It's a social goal, of course, but I was really excited. I got excited to see how that worked and how finance was just a basis to really achieve the ultimate goal. So I think we should connect the two, as I said, because they can learn from each other.
I thank you very much for that. I thought it was very pleasing to see that different bits of Accountancy Europe, at least, are looking to learn from each other. So I think that's a good message. I think we could now open this up to make it a panel discussion. So Cecilia, Vivi, and Carol can turn on their cameras. Good. I think I will start with a question that I have, which is a little bit inspired by all of you, which is, you know, the public sector covers just a tremendous variety of entities from, I don't know, I mean, we always pick small local authorities, but schools in the UK, a school is a reporting entity, part of the public sector, which with, you know, and at the other end of the scale, we have, I don't know, international bodies, or we have big government ministries. Do they all have to tell the same sort of story in terms of sustainability? Or, I mean, is there a one-size-fits-all solution, or are there things that ought to be common to sustainability reporting between all of them? Who'd like to pick that up?
Well, I can start if you wish, and again, I'll make the comparison to the private sector. In the private sector, what I have seen is that in the end of the day, every company is unique. So we are currently working towards global standards and European standards, as I think most of us know, and that is a good thing. Now for the private sector, carbon emissions, climate will be the number one topic that we're gonna harmonize most expectedly. If you look at the public sector, I could see a similar development, draw a parallel there, because climate change is just hitting all of us. But then in addition to that, you know, if you say, like, should the one school report similar to the other school, I would say yes. Should the one hospital report comparably to another hospital, I would say yes. So similar levels of harmonization, but in the end of the day, every organization, if you like, also has its unique characteristics or its unique objectives that I think they should be able to disclose on. So that is my 2 cents as an intro into others' contributions.
Carol?
I can add something there. So, I mean, I think the GRI standards can be used by any type of organisation. It's a case of working out what are the material issues there. Now, we mentioned climate change. So, for a school, the issue there would be what are you doing about educating children, not just about climate change, but also about the impact of climate change on all the other sustainable development issues. And so giving them that ability to think about the interconnectedness of sustainable development issues is going to be critical, and then disclosing what you're doing around that.
Cecilia, maybe I could just very quickly comment. As I said, I'm not an expert on reporting, but what I can say is that does the public sector need to integrate sustainability in its work? Absolutely. And do we need to does everyone need to report on it? I agree there with Wim. It has to be a case of all different entities are being, or well, they do have different possibilities and opportunities. So in some way, but not in the same way. So in answer to your very leading question, Peter, is there a one size fits all? No. Do we all need to work on it? Yes.
Thank you very much. Vivi, would you like to come in?
Well, basically, I agree on everything that was said, and well, like if you start from the point of view of like reading the reports, if they are similar, I think something has gone like really badly wrong. So there should be something like really very, very, very specific and unique depending on the organization.
Peter, could I just step in?
You could indeed, Paul, please go ahead.
We've been looking at sustainability from an SME angle as well as part of my other work at Accountancy Europe. Does the panelists have any views as to whether it's more effective to go top down, from central government, whole of government accounts, for instance, or maybe to start with the smaller organisations with maybe more local impact and work upwards?
maybe I could jump on that, Paul. It's a very good question. And looking at reporting requirements for SMEs, I think you can look at it in a couple of different ways. We know that there will be reporting requirements from other parts towards SMEs. So there is no question of not doing anything, because financial institutions will demand sustainability information for financing. Customers will demand, larger companies in their value chain will demand it in the downstream and the upstream. So there will be pressure coming towards SMEs from different angles when it comes to keeping track of their sustainability record. So in one way or another, that will be an issue. So the question is it better to include that from the beginning and make it clear what can be expected of an SME to report? Or is it better to let the market, just lead the development? That's an very interesting question.
Any further?
Well, I think, Paul, to your question, and again, I don't know the public sector in any detail, but I could see that. As with many developments, if you like, it starts with, call it, the large organizations or the large entities that show like, we think that we need to do this, and then it trickles down into smaller organizations. If you look at what is happening in the EU now, where they started with listed companies and those were the only ones who need to report that. You could argue, like, is that really making the big difference to society, right? We always talk about the listed companies as being the important companies, but we forget that the major part of our economy is not listed and is quite small. And if we want to make an impact on society, we better address these. And having said that, if you think about the burden on organizations, if I think about those schools that I talked about as an example, if they would need to report on the sustainable development, etc., for such a small organization would be quite a burden. So I could see that it starts in this case with the Ministry of Education, and then it slowly trickles down. Although ideally we would like to capture them all in one go, but I just think that that is not feasible.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions from Slido as well. Slightly contentious one here. Without shareholder or investor pressure groups, will governments act boldly enough, especially given the tough decisions yet to be made? Somewhat controversial comment. EPSAS, the European Public Sector Accounting Standards, were not a good sign. If I could also piggyback onto that question with my own interest as to how the panelists would think that the current COVID recovery situation, is that a force for change for good, or more incentives for governments to not do sustainability reporting? The other question is, as has already been mentioned a couple of times, there's a lot going on in the sustainability reporting side of things. So, should governments wait and see how the sustainability reporting landscape develops, TCFD, Sustainability Standards Board, or should they be more proactive? Any takers?
Sorry, should who be more proactive?
Should governments be more proactive, or should they wait for the outcome of the work on the various different sustainability standards we're seeing at the moment?
Oh, well, I'm certainly very glad that the European Union has been proactive and focusing on the impact of organisations on sustainable development, because all the work I've done and seen shows that it's absolutely critical to be thinking about that, to be thinking about those impacts of the organisation and incorporating them into strategy to facilitate the change that we need to see, and just to focus on enterprise value and an investor perspective is limiting. It's not enough to create that change. and it may actually result in some significant impacts of the organisation not being disclosed and therefore not being managed. And that to me is a major concern. So I'm certainly very glad that the European Union has taken the initiative to regulate, because I think that will also influence large companies all around the world and will help to make that, a global practice.
Ideally, it would, wouldn't it? Cecilia, you made some comments on this subject in your presentation. I don't know if you'd like to expand upon them. You asked the question about whether the EU standards would be closely aligned with global standard setters, or would be.
But those are slightly different from when it comes to corporate governance. So those standards are the ones related to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, which are quite important that they are aligned with global standards. Sustainability standards in the larger sense is a much more complex issue, because there are so many voluntary standards today when it comes to sustainability standards that are not related to reporting, but to other types of standards when it comes to goods. So those are different. What I would like to jump on is the question: is COVID a possibility or a menace when it comes to post-COVID? Is that going to further the sustainability agenda or not? I think, speaking from a European perspective, it's quite clear that COVID has not slowed down when it comes to the sustainability agenda. I think the European Union today is probably the most ambitious. Has the most ambitious agenda when it comes to that. The Green Deal and all the different initiatives coming up now that are related to corporate sustainability. I think the challenge in the EU is to make them work together, so that we don't get a lot of different initiatives that are not properly coordinated. So again, the issue of coherence is going to be very important, because otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of different exercises of ticking boxes and less focus on actually making a difference.
Indeed. Further comments on this? I mean, it strikes me that there's newspaper reports on this today. I mean, there's a particular policy coherence issue within the EU between the Green Deal and the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, where many people pointing to the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy as not being very green and not really delivering what is set out in the Green Deal. So there's really quite a fundamental policy coherence issue in very, very basic issues within the EU, which no doubt need to be addressed.
May I add here? Yeah, then on top of that, if we want to kind of include this kind of global spillover effects, it gets even more complicated. Like if we think this Agenda 2030 seriously, and we only look at the EU agricultural policy inside the EU, then if we look at the impacts it has, like globally, for instance, on the food markets in Africa or something, like it gets much more complicated. So there's also this kind of policy coherence if you take a global look, and that's probably like one of the challenges, like how to include such considerations in reporting as well. Like what kind of indicators could you use? Because we don't have that much information on these spillover effects yet.
Yes, okay. Always the danger of needing better information before you can make a good decision, isn't there? I don't know if the panelists had questions for each other. I did see that Olivier was making provocative comments. Is Olivier still with us? Yes. Olivier was making provocative comments in the chat, so I don't know if Olivier would like to take the floor and be provocative again.
It's a provocation, Peter. It looks like one. And well, I was using the chat box actually to draw attention on the work of the Stockholm Resilience Center, especially on the planetary boundaries. And especially a piece of research that basically speaks to the SDGs that I have heard mentioned many, many times in this conversation, on making the demonstration that it is nearly impossible to meet the SDGs unless we have radical policy change. And I think we're making great progress right now, and the only problem is that this great progress is in the wrong direction. We've been talking about this matter for more than 40 years, and now, if you look back the 5 past years, the situation is accelerating in the wrong direction. We continue increasing our carbon emissions. We continue increasing our waste. We continue increasing all the things that we should decrease. So, the big real question, and I've heard mention cost, burdens, incremental steps to change. And that, to my view, is all very good. It is our normal way of thinking. But the problem we have today is not normal. And I doubt that we will solve an abnormal problem with normal thinking. So what should we do? Simple question. But what we're doing is not enough. That is obvious. That's what the facts are saying.
I would go again to the policy coherence, if I again may say something like, let's take now this question of One Health. Like, it's okay, we have pandemic, we know a little bit about the root causes of it. It has something to do with the sustainability of the way we take care of our nature. And then we have human health. And these are usually dealt in a totally like different silos. But if we combine this thinking, like, we might be on a step forward.
Yeah. But can I ask a question to the experts, actually? Would it be possible to report on, the planetary boundaries?
You mean for public sector, I assume, Olivier?
Well, like you, Wim, I'm not sure I'm making such a strict divide between the public and the private sector.
Right. Okay.
Because that is the only benchmark that really matters, to my view.
I think we can. We can certainly do that with respect to climate change, I think. But to me, the key thing is for everybody in the accounting profession and outside to think about what they can do to change things. So a really key thing is how are we measuring the performance of organizations? Now, for universities, it's not aligned with sustainable development. It's not even aligned with how they can contribute to society and the environment through their core activities of research and education. And that is a major failing. The accounting profession, what are we asking qualified accountants to be able to do? What is the education that we're giving? The auditing profession need to be thinking about expanding the scope of assurance engagements. Those making capital investment expenditure decisions need to be thinking about how to incorporate sustainable development issues. So there's something that everybody can be doing in every day as they go about their work to stop and think about whether they're using the right measures and the right methods. And that, I think, would start to shift things. Would start to shift things, but we're not questioning enough.
Does that mean you want to be questioned? Because we can do that. Let me throw something in the debate, if I may, because we are, rightly, because that's what we've always done, thinking about reporting at the level of the entity. And that's great. But when you do get things from a macro perspective, from a system perspective, that is the only time where you see that things are going wrong. And the problem we have to solve is that reporting can show lots of improvement at entity level and lots of degradation at global level. And that's the bridge, that's the real challenge that not only we in the accountancy profession will have to solve, but that is, to my view, the real challenge that matters. Take the example of cars. The car industry has made absolutely fabulous technical progresses. I mean, my car today, yes, I have a car. My car today is emitting, I don't know how many times less than the previous one a few years ago. Okay, that's great progress at the level of the unit that is being sold. But as we continue selling as many units as we can, because we have no other model in mind, well, at the level of a transport system, things continue deteriorating, and this deterioration is accelerating. So I think we need to reverse totally, the conceptual framework, I was going to say, but that's a wrong word talking to accountants. But, we need to start from the limits. We can't continue starting from the entity, because otherwise we will continue exceeding the limits even without knowing and without willing. So we need to reverse the logic and start from the limits. We have a limited budget. We have a finite planet.
Well, I agree. And this is what national governments need to be thinking of when they submit their reports against the Sustainable Development Goals. This should be something that they're reporting on.
I just slightly have a reservation on this, I think, because the SDG is, a wonderful framework for policy making. In terms of being a reporting framework, there are a lot of them. There are really a lot of SDGs on which you can report your progress. So you'll always find one where you've made some progress. And I'm just sitting here listening to the debate and wondering whether, in the spirit of Olivier's presentation, we don't really need to focus on some key ones like what is our carbon footprint, what is our biodiversity footprint, and I'm not sure that that brings us to our planetary boundaries issue. So there might be a way of putting those together, but to be honest, I think the last thing this debate needs is someone to throw a new idea in at the end of the day. Look, we've entertainingly used all the time. Can I just ask the panelists to sort of make a closing statement each, and maybe we'll do it in the reverse order. So Wim can start and Vivi can finish. Is that okay? If you just make a quick closing sentence each, and we'll draw this to an end. Thank you.
Sure, and I would just say, based on the debate, but also I think the question: should we wait for the standards or start tomorrow? My closing comment would be really start tomorrow. It takes a while, it takes a journey, so get on with it.
Thank you, Wim. So let me cast my back. Carol, you're next.
Well, I share Olivier's big concerns that national policy makers need to be thinking of, but I also think that each of us as individuals need to be thinking about what we're doing in our decisions and in our roles and what we can do differently instead of just doing the same things all the time.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Cecilia.
Thank you. Well, closing comments. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm taking the part of the importance of policy making with me. But it is a challenge, because even though, as Carol said, it's important what we do as individuals, it's also important what we do as countries. But as countries, we're also part of a global community, and the big issue, I think, is how do we make this a global question? Because it's important that we work on a national level, but we won't resolve the systemic problems unless we can work on a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. And Vivi, you get virtually the last word. I get the last.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to say something about the global dimension as well, but maybe I go back to the SDGs. I talked a lot about them and okay, yeah, policy coherence, but as well the kind of ability to kind of be alert whether there are some risks, some emerging topics that are not actually addressed by the SDGs, so that we don't kind of stick to this framework and forget something important. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone who's participated and sent in questions and responded in other ways. Thank you to Paul and Andrea for wonderful organisation. Thank you to Olivier for coming and provoking in the way only he can. And I'm very pleased with this afternoon's discussion. I think this has been a very useful contribution to our thinking, and I hope we will return to this subject in the near future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.